let's talk about the head of NATO and his Ukraine visit, shall we? This is from Reuters. They say Ukrainian President Zelensky told visiting NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg on Thursday that it was time for the military alliance to offer his country membership and that Kiev needed more weapons to fight Russia. I don't see anyone talking about diplomacy, but you know. The NATO Secretary General's visit was likely to irk the Kremlin, which said earlier on Thursday that one of the main goals of its special military operation in Ukraine was to prevent it joining what Moscow regards as a hostile bloc. I mean, to play devil's advocate, Ukraine still hasn't joined NATO. But no, the real reason is not because, Russia is in Ukraine. The real reason is because they're playing you, man. They're playing you. NATO doesn't care about you. They don't care about you. You know why? Because if they cared about you, they would give you a good hug and say, time for diplomacy. Now we have to sit down and negotiate. Instead, they're giving you guns, so, you go kill off your own soldiers, but they're making money. Their friends are making money. So, you don't have to take my word for it. You can look at the strategy that's been going on for, more than a year now. Has it worked? No, not really. The war is still ongoing. How do you fix that? More weapons again? If NATO wanted you, they would have already, they'd have already granted you membership, because Finland, which was a so-called neutral country, went from neutral to pro-NATO to in NATO, and you're still outside NATO. When is Zelensky going to understand that they're playing him? They're using him. They're using him to poke the Russian bear. They don't care about you. If they cared about you, they would have never started this bullshit. They've been telling you since 2008, we want Ukraine and Bulgaria and NATO. Well, why aren't you in NATO? Isn't right now the crucial moment to add you to NATO? Is it right now the moment for Ukrainian membership? I mean, obviously you can say no, because then, you would trigger Article 5, and then you would draw the entire NATO membership, into a conflict with Russia. But I mean, isn't that what's already happening, really? Are they not providing Ukraine with weapons? Do they not have their special forces there? Has the United States not already given close to 80 or $100 billion? I mean, do you want nuclear missiles whistling over our heads for you to get it? I don't. I really don't. Zelensky has been invited to the NATO summit in Vilnius in July, and he said, quote, I'm grateful for the invitation to visit the summit, but it is also important for Ukraine to receive the corresponding invitation. He said, there's no objective barrier to the political decision to invite Ukraine into the alliance, and now, when most people in NATO countries and majority of Ukrainians support NATO accession, is the time for the corresponding decision. So this is the counter argument that I was going to make. That yes, so on one hand, you would draw, Article 5, you draw all of NATO into a war. The counter argument is what Zelensky just presented, which is that actually everybody in Europe and the West, they've all been brainwashed into thinking, well, okay, I'll try and keep it neutral. Zelensky's argument is that everybody now in the West actually supports NATO and Ukraine joining NATO. And everybody in Ukraine also supports NATO and Ukraine joining NATO. So actually now is the best time for Ukraine to join NATO, because everyone in the West really, really wants it. Fine. As you say. So tell me, Zelensky, why aren't you in NATO? Don't you see that they're using you as a tool? You yourself, I just read this quote, right? You yourself are saying that everyone wants you NATO, and somehow you just aren't in there, man. They just won't take your membership. They won't take your application. Don't you get it? When are you going to get it? As you said, now is the best time. Ukraine announced a bid for fast-track membership of NATO last September after the Kremlin said it had annexed 4 Ukrainian regions that its troops have partially occupied. The Kremlin reiterated to reporters on a conference call that Moscow opposed NATO admitting Ukraine, a former Soviet republic. Dmitry Peskov, who's the Kremlin spokesman, said that otherwise it will present a serious, significant danger to the security of our country. Now you'll have these morons who say, but Finland has joined NATO. Oh, guess your strategy doesn't work, Putin. I mean, look, as they say, the battle has just been lost. The battle may be lost, but the war's just begun. So that might be their position in Russia. The other thing that one might add is that Finland does share a border with the Russians, but it's not Ukraine. They don't. You have to understand, Ukraine, from an emotional and cultural point of view, is way, way, way closer to Russia than Finland is. The border is also bigger. It's not a question of who has the bigger border with Russia, because they have already got five, 6 countries now bordering Russia. But I go back to my original point, which is the emotional and cultural and linguistic connection between Russia and Ukraine. They were literally one country at one point, not that long ago. It was the same country, right? Finland wasn't. Do you understand? So for Russians to accept that Ukraine is now a NATO member is much harder to swallow than to accept Finland. Now, from a security point of view, you could once again argue that that both there are pros and cons. Or I don't see many pros, but you could argue which is the lesser evil from their point of view, from the Russian point of view, right? Some of them might think that Ukraine being in NATO in terms of security presents a greater risk. Others might say it's Finland. I think, me personally, my opinion is that this is just provocation. Whether, the border between NATO members and Russia is this big or that big, it's the same. It's the same thing. If you start coming to my house, my country, my castle, and outside my moat, you've got, you're sending knights and cavalry to stare at me from across the moat or across the field, I'm going to feel provoked, and I'm going to do some shit about that. This is, this is no different from how the Americans would act. And that for a fact. Just look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a fact. Look at how they lost it. They lost it when the Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba. And hey, the Soviets did this after the Americans put nuclear missiles in Turkey, the Jupiter missiles. The Cubans allowed the Soviets to do that after the Americans tried to coup the Cuban government. So the Cubans and the Soviets had every right to do that from their point of view. And if we're looking at who started it, the Americans did. The Americans attacked Cuba. The Americans threatened Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a response to American aggression. A response. It wasn't an escalation or instigation. Escalation, yes, you could argue it was. But it wasn't, the Soviets starting or something, or the Cubans starting something. No. Now, was that the wise thing to do? I don't know. It also almost destroyed the planet, so maybe not. But you understand how when the Americans realized there are nuclear missiles, near their borders, they lost it. So why is this so difficult to grasp for people in the West, that 5, 6 NATO countries bordering Russia is going to piss the Russians off at one point or another? And the fact that the Finns have joined out doesn't make that any better. It's still going to make the Russians angry, I think this is insane that they try to present it. Oh, it's purely Russian aggression. You want some aggression? I'll show you aggression, man. Look at Iraq, 2003, Britain and the United States. That's aggression. That's real aggression. The Russians, they can at least argue that their border, they literally share a border with Ukraine. Are you going to tell me Iraq and the United Kingdom share a border? There's no threat there. And yet most people, they kind of acquiesce to that. Not everyone. I think most of the world was quite angry and awake. But over time, people kind of just like shrugged their arms and, oh, well. Anyway, I don't want to get too carried off. Let me play you Stoltenberg. I don't want to interrupt the big man.
Ukraine's future is in the Euro-Atlantic family. Ukraine's future is in NATO. All allies agree on that. At the same time, the main focus of the alliance, of NATO allies now, is to ensure that Ukraine prevails, is to ensure that Ukraine continues to be a sovereign, independent, democratic nation in Europe. Because that's the only way to also have a meaningful discussion about Ukraine's future membership.
He's trying to remember all the buzzwords. Democratic, free, Western. Yes. We just stop it, man. A few years ago, you were all calling Ukraine the most corrupt country in Europe or the world. I forget which, and it really doesn't change my point. You were all saying there are Nazis in Ukraine, and on top of that, it's the most corrupt country hey. Now all of a sudden it's a bastion of European values, whatever that means. Are you telling me it's a bastion of colonialism? What does it mean, European values? Because there aren't. I mean, look, I'm being cheeky, but Western values. If you look at the foreign policy, I think it's better you didn't say those words, right? But they have all the buzzwords, democratic and free, and that's how it needs to be. Yes. Here's a map. I don't know why I have to pull this up. I mean, it's kind of, kind of a moot point because I laid it all out. But, you tell me who's threatening who. In red, the Russian-led CSTO, which is, it's kind of calling it a successor to the Warsaw Pact is being very generous, very generous. Then you have countries in purple. So in purple, countries seeking NATO membership, countries in light blue in the process of accession, and then dark blue is NATO member countries. Just look how many. Just look how many border the Russians. Does this mean that they should be in Ukraine? It's not about, giving them permission or not. The problem is that the Russians they're a power, and on top of that, they have nuclear weapons. So, it's whatever you do, it's like walking in a minefield, And the problem is that the people who are running Western foreign policy, they've put the blindfold on and they're just happily running there, and they don't care what happens to who. They don't care that they're hurting Ukraine. They don't care that they're hurting Europe. They don't care that they're hurting the United States. Everybody's purchasing power has gone down. Inflation is up. They're just crapping all over everything because for them it makes sense. For them it makes sense to provoke the Russians because that's actually what they want, right? They want to make money. And anyone who's looking at this map and telling me that this is about security and it's about it's about Europe acting as one and the West being together and cuddling and, they're having a group session. Please stick that where the sun don't shine because I am not tolerating this drivel. Over here, we're dealing with geopolitics. We're dealing with international relations. This doesn't work like that. Your buzzwords, Mr. Stoltenberg, don't mean anything. So you can keep yelling all day about, Ukraine has to be this and that. But at the end of the day, you're the one destroying Ukraine because you forced the Russians' hand. That doesn't mean you have to like the Russians or care for the Russians. We're talking about A and B. You got two powers here, NATO and Russia. And one it keeps provoking the other, and now that one's retaliating. And this is bad for everybody. So why don't we take a step back and do some diplomacy for a change? Have you tried that, Mr. Stoltenberg? Because it's like nobody learns a lesson. Nobody even thinks like, how can we actually fix the situation? Like actually solve it. He's going to Kiev and dangling NATO membership and insulting the Ukrainians to their faces. And Zelensky's like, oh, yes, please. Dude, they're using you. If they wanted to put you in NATO, they already would have. How come Finland went from neutral to pro-NATO to inside NATO faster, in the span of a few months? And Ukraine has been here begging for years, let us inside of NATO. And right now, Ukraine needs that. Ukraine needs NATO support and NATO membership, and they still won't give it to you. When are you going to get that they're using you, man? They're playing you to screw with the Russians because it's always been about screwing the Russians. But actually, it's screw everybody in the whole planet, Maybe we'll have World War III, who knows, Is that a gamble? Is that a reasonable gamble? Who takes this gamble? This is madness. This is not something you gamble with. Like I said, man, if they were going to get Ukraine inside of NATO, they would have already done it. If they were going to give Ukraine EU membership, they would have already done it. They're never going to do it. It's definitely not for the foreseeable future because they're using Ukraine to screw with the Russians. That's all they care about. And this guy is really insulting people. How the hell is Finland in NATO, but Ukraine isn't? After all the shitstorm cooked up now about Ukraine, and Ukraine's still not, man. They're never gonna give it to you. I almost feel bad, man, for Zelensky. I almost feel bad for this guy. He's being taken for such a ride. The problem is that he's not the one who's really suffering from it, is he? You know, he's protected. The Russians will not dare to touch him because they're not psychotic. I mean that. They wouldn't dream of killing this guy. The problem is that the 7-8 million Ukrainian refugees, they're the ones getting screwed, you know? And all the other people that are in the war, fighting it or being shelled and all this stuff. But, you know, why should they have to suffer for some fake membership that you are never going to get, that this idiot here is dangling in front of you? What, is it worth it? Absolutely not. I mean, let's be real though, the Russians think it's serious enough to start their quote unquote special military operation. I mean, you know, if we're going to say start a war, the war started in 2014 and now it just escalated. So, you know, it started almost 10 years ago. But they definitely forced the Russians' hand. And the thing is, if you're going to give them all of these weapons to Ukraine, because right here they're saying that Washington announced $325 million in new military aid on Wednesday. This is additional, right? Including ammunition for the HIMARS and advanced missiles and anti-tank mines. And Denmark and the Netherlands announced they would jointly donate 14 Leopard 2 tanks. So there's all these new weapons and fresh money coming in. You've already given 80 billion. Close to 80 billion. Has that helped? This money is going straight to the pockets of the people who build the tanks and build the weapons. And the worst part is that they're giving the HIMARS system. I mean, how long is it before these weapons start ending up in other places in Europe or around the world? Because I can guarantee you there are people on the black market that are stealing these shipments and selling them off wherever, you know? Is this, again, where's the oversight? You know, Rand Paul was asking just to have, you know, an inspector general appointed for oversight. They're like, no. How do you give somebody tens of billions of dollars and you don't care where the money goes? Dude, how can you not have oversight? What is this? Are you giving cookies away or something? Oh my God. I mean, it's comical. It's actually comical. We live in a simulation, as some people love to say, right? This HIMARS, by the way, this system, I talked a lot about this here on the show, right? And they've given the Ukrainians this system, but only with short range payloads or munitions or ordnance. So they're giving them a system that is very, capable, and they're giving them ammunition that cannot reach inside of Russia. Okay, but how long before they actually get their hands on ammunition that can reach inside Russia? What if someone is giving it to them covertly? My question here, is this another risk you want to take? Do you really want to fire HIMARS munitions and ordnance inside of Russia? How many times can you do that and get away with it? How far can you fire inside of Russia and still get away with it? Are these gambles you really want to take? I don't think anyone should be gambling with this or playing with this. This is not diplomacy, and these people are not serious about stopping the war. If they were, none of this would be happening. They will be at a table, sitting down and speaking. Period.